Thanks, Dr. Duran, for that nice introduction. And thank you all for coming out tonight. It would be very improper, and I'm sure my dad would be upset if I didn't thank you all for coming out tonight. And I just want to recognize a couple of people from the get-go. My dad's here tonight, who's put up with me for far too many years of attitude swings and being super cranky and researching over these years. As well as two of the three of my original master's thesis panelists here, Dr. Liz Brock and Dr. Centeno. Special thanks to them for being very patient with me in grad school, and none of this reflects, it's all my work, my mistakes, my work, not theirs. But thank you all for coming out tonight. I first got interested in this topic because really as a young kid who grew up in the world of politics, I've always had like a soft spot for the presidency. And then I thought it was an interesting sort of relationship of, you know, what politicians do, as well as like what's expected of their wives or husbands, you know, their spouses. And it's something that when my dad was in politics, my mom sort of begrudgingly did in her time as a political spouse. And so that developed into first ladies, which I studied a lot in grad school. So a couple of disclaimers from the get-go. I'm not really presenting on like who is the ultimate and absolute best first lady. You know, I do have some biases towards that. But it's not necessarily about like ranking them. Nor am I deliberately leaving any of them out. I'm really only going to talk about like 6 tonight. But I don't mean any like disrespect by those who aren't presented tonight. As well as I think I have a really good balance between the more conservative first ladies and liberal first ladies. But that doesn't really matter in the first ladyship. What matters is the activists towards programs and causes, mainly. But however, it's more about understanding the office of the First Lady and its relationship to the presidency and what that means. Also at the last minute, because you know research is never absolute in this, that I switched Barbara Bush out for Betty Ford, but I'll talk about Barbara Bush too, so I don't want to mess up if you all were wanting to hear about Barbara Bush. As well as if it happens, I guess it happens. But I am going to try and shy away from whether or not Hillary Clinton's going to become president. If that topic comes up in the discussion, I guess we'll go forth with that. But I'm only going to focus really on her first ladyship. So, first ladies in memory. You know, we all probably grew up with some sort of consciousness about who the first lady is, right, from an early age to adulthood and so forth. If we were living 150 years ago, 100 years ago, we probably wouldn't easily recognize who the First Lady is or even know what her name is. But it's something that has been part of our world and our understanding, at least in the presidency, all of our lives, right? But diving deeper into that, like, you know, what's the rules? What are the expectations? So, like the presidency, there's been 44 presidents. There's always been a first lady or a first lady person within it, right? Not all the presidents were married. James Buchanan, never married, but his niece, Harriet Lane, you know, stepped up into the first lady roles. And we kind of, those that aren't actually married to the president, we just call White House hostesses or, you know, first lady surrogates. Grover Cleveland, in his first term as president, wasn't married. One of his nieces, you know, stepped in that role, but in his second term, he did get married. Some first ladies have died. You know, the one that comes to mind off the top of my head is Alan Wilson, Woodrow Wilson's first wife, and then shortly later, he married Edith Wilson. But at least for what we're going to do tonight, the expectations of the First Lady, what does it mean? You know, what sort of powers, influence do they have? And really this develops from the 1930s forward, especially Eleanor Roosevelt. She's pivotal. She's a very important And, you know, she's very essential to Franklin Roosevelt. All right. So, I don't expect all of us to have ever read the Constitution. I will admit that I haven't read it in full in quite a while. But my last reading of it, there's any indication whatsoever, or even mention of a First Lady. Right? But we know, over history, First Lady, yields a lot of influence and power. So, where are the constitutional instructions? Right? Even when you look at just the presidency, there's very little direction in that, other than commander-in-chief, chief executive, government, so on and so forth. There's really no instruction at all. And so, I argue that all of this is made from scratch, right? This idea of tradition and customs. And, it matters, and I'll get to it here in a second, but, it truly did matter what Martha Washington did when she first arrived in Philadelphia, when George asked her to come, right? Because she barely had one foot out of the carriage and she already had a role. She had a responsibility. And then over time, we have these extreme activists, very involved first ladies, and some of them become controversial, like Edith Wilson, right? After World War I was ending, Wilson has a stroke, he becomes incapacitated, and Edith does everything in her power to make sure no one sees him, right? She kind of locks him away in the presidential bedroom, and she lets, she doesn't let the vice president, cabinet, senators, house members, anyone see him at all. And so the only way that, she allowed communication, if we can call that, was she would go out, meet with them, go back in where he was, the room where he was, discuss. I doubt there was any discussion that was going on. And then she would come back and say what he said, right? And so, another sort of caveat of this is, what would happen if we get our first female president? We already kind of had one, right? That's just a fact. So once First Lady become institutionalized, it's very well known that there's the office of the First Lady. It's in the East Wing. It's primarily always been in the East Wing. It moves from the residence down to the East Wing, except for Hillary Clinton, who moves it to the West Wing because she needed to be closer to Bill and have a say in a lot. But at least for the office of the First Lady gets a chief of staff. She gets aides. She gets a press secretary. She gets a budget. She gets other staff members to help her go about her daily routines. As well as, we'll see that, talked about a little bit, there's White House hostesses. And these are, this last bullet point is really the sort of roles that First Ladies have, hostess, advisor, manager, emissaries, and activists. Or sometimes they're absentee, and we'll see that in the animation. So, before we do that, one might ask, why study the First Ladies? What's important about the First Ladies? And then, has there been any scholarship? And yeah, it's growing. It really is growing. There's more attention being paid to the First Ladies. If you tune into C-SPAN, their series, they did that whole big block on First Ladies. So these are some of the leading scholars. Paul Bowler, who wrote Anecdotal History, right? He died a couple of years ago. Yeah, but he's a professor at Texas Christian University, and really he focuses on, in this work, the background, characteristics, and personalities. They're key to understanding the relationship that these women had to the presidents, right? And although this is not really high scholarship in the sense of like analysis and stuff like that, it's quite often cited. And I'm not quite ready to, concede that it's not the absolute greatest there is. Betty Boyd Caroli has a PhD from New York University. in American civilization, but she holds no academic role, position anywhere. And she's a feminist, right? She writes on feminist stuff. And in her book, you know, her whole outlook, it might sound kind of anti-feminist, because she argues that these first ladies only have this position. Actually, you know, there's no job description, there's no real expectation. The only way that she has this position is she has a marriage certificate, right? And so, you know, there is something to that, you know, if they weren't married to the president, then possibly they would not have gone on to do other things. Anthony Iskarowitz has several readers about the First Lady, and his main focus is really about, you know, analyzing the growth and influence of political influence, and he's a professor at James Madison. Robert Watson, professor at Florida Atlantic University, he really focuses on the influential force in presidential politics, you know, specializing in first ladies as well. And so those are some of the leading scholars of First Lady history. But I also kind of included some presidents who have said stuff about studying First Ladies or not. Harry S. Truman, who, you know, recognizes that Bess Truman, his wife, really was a key aspect in his life and in his political career. All right, and so he said that people ought to they definitely should study the First Lady, because that will expose a lot about the presidency. James Monroe said quite the opposite. He said you should never study. You shouldn't even, the wives don't matter at all. And Martin Van Buren said women should only appear in the news 3 times: when they're born, when they get married, and when they die. So, you know, I guess I would disagree with Monroe and Van Buren. So, maybe this is vain, but, you know, I've written all this. So this is what I say. I took this straight from my thesis, right? And so you don't have to read it all, but basically my premise really is that, you know, that there's a unique power and influence in this inherited position that champions causes and programs, whatever it might be, right? And a lot of the programs and causes that First Ladies take up are near and dear to their heart. All right, so history and development. Like I said, it mattered what Martha Washington did when she arrived in Philadelphia in 1790. She didn't go to George Washington's inauguration. She didn't even go to the Capitol for a little over a year. All right? But he writes to her, says, "Why don't you join me?" So she packs up all their, you know, most of their belongings, and their, you know, the couple of children that were left in the house, and they go to Philadelphia, the capital. She gets like 1 foot out of the carriage. He meets and greets her, and he says, "I need you to prepare a dinner. I'm hosting some dignitaries." Right? And so, like, she has to put on this big, elaborate dinner. And, you know, it's very traditional that in any of the White House functions that, you know, the First Lady is, you know, the main planner and all this. And these essentially become the state dinners, right? Whenever there's a foreign dignitary or whatnot, the state dinners is usually a First Lady function. And she's the creator of that. And then, you know, at least the first couple of First Ladies that we've had really take a lot of, you know, what they do according to what Martha did, right? So you get some of these early activist First Ladies, and like Dolly Madison, Sarah Polk, Mary Todd Lincoln, you know, each have a unique thing. Dolly Madison actually sort of steps in because Martha Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson's wife, died 16 years before he became president. So there was no First Lady under the Jefferson presidency. And so Dolly Madison, as second lady, essentially kind of filled that role. And what she does that is important in ways is she becomes a truly popular social, elite in the capital city. And she, at times, reading through her diaries and other accounts, she is typically has a busier social schedule than James Madison, because he spends time in his office a lot and does that. But she's usually, more of a socially and travels a lot more. Sarah Polk, I find her extremely interesting in the sense of, under James Polk's presidency, the slavery question is starting to seriously erupt in the country. And, one of my more favorite stories of any of the first ladies comes from Sarah Polk, in which she is doing something around the president's office. She looks outside, sees all the slaves working the White House grounds, and she calls James over to look, and she asks him, the simple question, do you think these people want to do this? Do you think they want to be in slavery? Right? And so for a first lady to sort of embrace that slavery question and that equality, and I think is quite amazing. And then Mary Todd Lincoln. I will admit a couple of things. When I saw Lincoln, the movie that came out a couple of years ago, I really hated how they portrayed her. I absolutely did. And then I had to think about it a little bit. Mary Todd had a lot of things that went wrong that caused her to just go crazy. Right? Her family comes from Kentucky, and a lot of her family they're part of the Confederacy. She has uncles and cousins that are fighting in the Confederacy against her husband, President Lincoln. As well as, she has a couple of kids that died. That's enough, really, to have any parent go crazy. As well as, what she does, because she, the White House is really, really, damp, and there's mold all over the walls, and, nothing matches, and so she spends a lot of money, a significant amount of money, where the House of Representatives actually investigates her, why she's spending all this money. And so really Mary Todd Lincoln becomes like this target of ridicule, and which further, doesn't help her mental stability. But she becomes, one of the first ladies that gets attacked, and, that is noteworthy. But in the young nation, post-Civil War era, you get these absentee first ladies where they would, some of them would actually go to the White House. Often they stayed home wherever that was, and they would send their daughters, their nieces, whatever, to kind of go and fill in for them every now and then. First ladies of the United States, that's what FLOTUS means. Advisors, right? Wilson talked about her and her control over Woodrow Wilson and making decisions. All right, that's sort of like the new era of the First Lady. When you leave this absentee from the post-Civil War era, Wilson becomes way more active with them. And then Lou Hoover is the first one that said, First ladies should always have a cause and program that they sponsor. That was her. And then she took it to the airwaves. She was a big sponsor of the Girl Scouts, and then volunteerism, right? And ever since then, every First Lady since Lou Hoover has sponsored at least one program or cause. Eleanor Roosevelt comes after Lou Hoover to Michelle Obama. You see these very personal, deep-rooted, a lot of it's their own circumstances where they come from, of why they have these causes. So, let's talk about a couple of them. Eleanor Roosevelt. By far, considered the absolute best First Lady. She's the longest serving First Lady, and she's extremely active every day, you know, from waking up to going to bed. But to understand Eleanor and why she did this, I think you have to know about her background, and which is full of constant pain and conflict. So, from a young age, this doesn't really matter, but it's part of the narrative, right? She was not really good looking, and that was commented on a lot. A lot of people said that about her all the time. She had a father that was basically an alcoholic and never around. This is Theodore Roosevelt's brother, to make that connection, he's gone a lot. And all she really wants is his approval, right? She really has just, you know, that's the parent that she attaches to, all that. Her mother dies young, so she is sent to her grandmother, who just has basically a disregard for her. Every now and then her father would come back in her life and, you know, she would be happy and, you know, but then he'd go away, then he dies. She marries a cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, right? And his mother really doesn't like her at all, to the point where, you know, later in their marriage when they have kids, Franklin's mom would tell the kids, you know, Eleanor's kids, like, she's not your mother, I am, right? Like, disregard her. Not only that, Franklin is just really not nice to her at all. He cheats on her, like several times. You know, she finds, as she's unpacking his bag from a trip when he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Eleanor finds out that he's having this like long, drawn out affair. She offers him an out, saying, you know, like, we'll divorce, we'll separate. His mother intervenes because in this time period, if you get a divorce, that's political suicide. So if that wasn't going to happen, they worked it out. And they decided to move into just a partnership, right? So she is with him when he's governor of New York and all that. So as you can see in a very succinct way, she's just, you know, her parade is rained on all the time. And so she's seeking approval. So, you know, she could have been bitter. She could have just, you know, hated everything in life. But she uses that pain and she channels it towards, you know, helping others. So FDR becomes president, New Deal happens, and because, you know, now we can talk about it, FDR has polio, so his mobility is not that great. But she goes out. Not only does she go out to get support for the New Deal, but then afterwards she goes and you know, gathers more after New Deal's going on, Second New Deal, stuff like that. But what I really want to focus on is civil rights and human rights, because I think this is where she shines greatly. So, Eleanor Roosevelt, really, really, really good about you know, not having any discrimination, you know, racist, prejudice bone in her whole body. So two stories, at least on civil rights, that are worth mentioning. In 1939, Marian Anderson gave a concert at Lincoln Memorial on Easter Sunday. That wasn't supposed to happen at all. What was supposed to occur was Marian Anderson was supposed to give a concert at Independence Hall. And Independence Hall is ran by the Daughters of the American Revolution, the daughter. Marian Anderson was also African American, and the Daughters of the American Revolution didn't want this. And so became this big issue. Eleanor is actually a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution, got deeply upset by this, helped Marian move the concert from Independence Hall to the Lincoln Memorial, where I think it's probably a better situation. Anyway, she resigns her membership from the DAR, and it's one of the largest, at the time, one of the largest radio productions there are And then over time, Marian Anderson would give, similar concerts in commemoration of that as well. Also in 1939, Eleanor Roosevelt was invited down to Birmingham, Alabama to the Southern Conference on Human Welfare. So she arrives down there, and as she's walking in, she notices something very ironic and wrong. There's segregated seating, right? So this is a conference on human rights and human welfare and rights. So, as she's seated, what she slowly does, over the course of this conference, is she moves her seat to the middle. Right? And that's, I think, is a very powerful message of what she thought about it as well. As well as Eleanor Roosevelt in human rights, she opposes the administration's ban on Japanese Americans when they were put in internment camps. She, at least in reading all the accounts, I really think she really gave it to FDR on that. And then she very, very much supported African Americans in the military. And she would very often go to Tuskegee, the Institute, and promote that as well. And then probably what she is known for worldwide is the Declaration of Human Rights. That comes after she's First Lady. She heads this commission that drafts the Declaration of Human Rights. And, it's presented and adopted and still a good part of the United Nations. So we all know, Eleanor Roosevelt is definitely a very influential person in politics, right? FDR needed her, and she gained a lot of support. In 1940, Roosevelt, the president, decides to break tradition and run for a third term. Right? And there's some politics about that, whether or not he should have done it, should not. Interesting enough, his vice president turns against him, right, and decides to challenge him for the nomination. And FDR wants another person to be his running mate. However, the Democrats aren't really, allowing him to do that. And so he, because it's all about, fighting Hitler and the Nazis in Europe. FDR wants it his way, the Democrats want it another way. And so what does he do? He sends Eleanor to go smooth everything over. So she arrives in Chicago, makes a speech, the, No Ordinary Times speech. If you ever get a chance to read it, it's really brief, but really insightful. She gives a speech, guess what happens? FDR gets his way, right? And I think it's in large part to Eleanor Roosevelt. But if there's anything, what makes her most important, in my opinion, is that she, really establishes what the First Lady does, especially in the modern, that you need to be activists, that you have to do stuff. And then, then she later becomes, as Truman yet again states at her funeral, that she's First Lady of the world, and I think she truly is. Lady Bird Johnson, skipping ahead a little bit, she has a really unique, outlook on what the First Lady does. Probably unlike Lyndon Baines Johnson, I don't think she wanted to become First Lady, whereas Lyndon wanted to be president, right? Like that was deep down. But Jackie Kennedy really helped in a way to prepare Lady Bird for what First Ladies do. Jackie Kennedy, for a little bit of background information on that, she had young kids in the White House, and so she wanted to keep them out of the spotlight as best as she could, as well as, John F. Kennedy wasn't always very good to her, right? He cheated on her and did all that, and that caused her embarrassment. And so whenever something came out and something was being hosted at the White House, she would not go. She didn't want to face that public ridicule of what the president was doing and what was expected of her. So Jackie sent Lady Bird often to all these events, and so and I've read in several accounts. I've never done the actual telling of this, but a lot of the scholars note that Lady Bird actually attended more First Lady functions under Jacqueline Kennedy's First Ladyship than Jackie actually did. But at least under Lady Bird, before she becomes First Lady, Second Lady becomes important. She also structures, starts creating those foundations for what the structure of the office of First Lady looks like. She's the first one to have a press secretary, and the first one to have staff members and aides to help her with it. So, kind of moving along, modernizing that office. What is, best known is also to the sort of independent side of First Ladies. Right, and so, you're going with advisors, emissaries, all this, but you're also getting this new shift in independent First Ladies. And so, Lady Bird seeks her own legislation, the Beautification Act. And how did this come along? So, Lady Bird, the Johnsons were from Texas, and Lady Bird really hated planes. She did not like to fly in planes at all. So, what would often happen is, when she'd go home to Texas, have to go back to Washington, D.C., they would just drive her, right? Because she didn't like flying. It was not really taboo in the 60s to, some of us probably done this. You're making a road trip, what do you get? You get gas, you get snacks, right? That's usually what happens. And then, after you're done with the snacks or your drink, what happens? Now you have trash. What do some people do? What's taboo for us now? You throw it out, right? And so I'm gonna steal from Dr. Loose Rock on this a little bit, but if you do that, you're kind of a jerk, right? And it's become taboo. You don't throw stuff out the window, or you shouldn't, right? It's frowned upon. Back then, no one thought of this, right? This is just, you're done with the candy, or you just throw it. Simple as that. And then what happens? Trash. Trash builds up, right? And so as she's making these journeys up to Washington, D.C., she notices that the country has a lot of litter. Not only just trash litter, but billboards, right? Just, yeah, not good at all. And so she didn't like that. And so she comes up with her own legislation. Some of you probably know about that one commercial with the Native American crying, right? Yeah. I really meant to do that. But she passes this legislation to stop not only air pollution, i.e. billboards, but make it so we're you don't throw stuff out the window. Interesting note on that. She really hated that it was called the Beautification Act because it was too pretty, and and it was like it had too much of a cosmetic nomenclature to it. But she does it, right? And she does it without the president's help. He signs it into law, and then she extends it first into Washington, D.C., and you can see that she's planting flowers and making D.C. look presentable. However, she receives some flack from it, right? And so this one cartoon, with one main billboard says "Impeach Lady Bird," because how dare the First Lady, go about and do her own stuff, and as if they couldn't. Anyone can get any legislation passed through Congress as long as they have a congressional member to do it for them. You don't have to be a member of Congress. All right, Betty Ford. This is the one I swapped out because I think she's really, really important. And she's just fun to read about. So, Betty Ford. How did Jerry Ford become president? Nixon, right? Nixon, Watergate. And that sort of like casts this kind of dark shadow over the United States, right? How can the president do this? And so, not only that, Jerry Ford, not elected to the vice presidency, not elected to the president. Do you know what he really wanted to do? He just really wanted to be the Speaker of the House. That's all. And there's in his writings, once he became Speaker, then he was just going to retire, right? He was going to do that one term and then leave, go back home. But you have this really interesting presidential transition, like, can you trust the president anymore? As well as, by extension, can you trust the First Lady? And so what does Betty Ford do? Betty Ford, if anything, cannot be quiet at all. Anything whatsoever. But that's good. Why? Because she raised a lot of consciousness about health. Shortly before becoming the First Lady, she gets a mastectomy. And sort of in this nature, you don't really talk about it publicly. What does she do? She talks about it a lot, right? And she claims that, like having this mastectomy not only saved her life, but is, we shouldn't be afraid to talk about it. And so she goes and talks about it a lot. And what happens? People, women who, this health consciousness becomes a real thing. And, the best part about breast cancer is early detection, right? That's how you beat it. And so she talks about it. She also goes on to talk about other taboo things: sex, drugs, and abortion. Right? And so, although she's Republican, she's this interesting kind of Republican, right? So she might be, fiscally conservative, but definitely socially liberal. Also, too, the Ford kids are wild in the White House, right? They like to party a lot, and it was known. So she was asked once, what do you think about this? And she's like, I don't really care, right? Like, they can do whatever they want. They're teenagers, Best way to figure out if you don't like something is to try it out, right? That's what she said. And so, and then she was asked about one of her daughters, like, do you think that she's having premarital sex? Because, that could be an issue. And she said, so what, right? And then she continues to say, like, if she was a teenager, she would probably be having premarital sex. If she was a teenager, she'd probably try weed and other drugs and all that, right? So the First Lady saying this in the 70s? Come on. And then she goes on to say widely that, abortion, no big deal, right? Pro-choice, that's where it's at. However, the sad story of Betty Ford is she's a victim of her time. Right? In the conservative 50s, under domesticity and this, the white picket fence, nuclear family, right? Get married, have a couple of kids, husband goes off and works, wife stays home, raises the kids. Sounds okay, but problems arise from that. And so she becomes victim of it, right? We know that from that ideal, that a lot of women suffered problems, right? Sort of like this new wave of feminist thought comes from it. It happens to her. She marries young, divorces her first husband, meets Jerry, they marry, and she's pushed into this motherhood-only role. And what happens, because you become so isolated and alienated from everything, she gets addicted to alcohol and tranquilizers because that numbs out her wifely and motherly duties, right? This continues on into the White House, and as we know, in her post-FLOTUS era significance, the Betty Ford Center. It's about addictions, because she was an addict. And an addict several times over. It was, it was alcohol, it was prescription drugs, it was tranquilizers, and all this. It took several interventions for the Ford family to finally make her realize that she is an addict and all that. However, she turns a really sort of dark side of her past into a good side with the Betty Ford Center, right? And then she goes on to continue to talk about addiction and substance abuse. Rosalynn Carter is an interesting one. So, under Rosalynn Carter, you get the full establishment of the East Wing. Right? It's remodeled, in its sort of finalized form in the East Wing, second floor, that you have not only the office of the First Lady, but all of her aides, chief of staff, and all that. What Rosalynn Carter does is becomes extremely active in the daily proceedings of the presidency, right? She's Jimmy Carter's presidential proxy. When he can't go out and do something, he sends her to go do it, right? One of the more interesting ones, when under Jimmy Carter, when relations with Latin America aren't so great and he's got to sort of fix that problem, he doesn't go, he sends her, right? And some leaders don't really want to talk to her, but she, for whatever it's worth, kind of, smooths some stuff over. She is very present in the cabinet. The cabinet's group of presidential advisors, and so, it might be blurry, but here's Jimmy Carter, and here's Rosalynn. She's always behind him, right? And then later, sometimes she actually moves to the table, to the cabinet table. But it would be very common on a daily basis that, they wake up, have breakfast, he goes about his day. They had lunch meetings regularly, and then they had evening briefings together, and they would talk about stuff, right? She also has her own independent causes, mental health. She's a real big advocate of that. And, just like Jimmy Carter, she probably has had more success after the presidency is over than within the presidency. And you can see them here, the Habitat for Humanity. They're always doing something, building something, or talking about something, right? Really active in their post-presidency. Nancy Reagan. Recently passed away, sad situation. A lot of people in the White House had a lot of nicknames for Nancy because Ronnie did not run the White House. The chief of staff did not run the White House. She ran the White House. Right. Okay, so President Reagan, in his early days, has that assassination attempt. A lot of people rally around him. He gathers more support, and he's popular, but he gets more support in that way. And what does Nancy do? She becomes a super presidential protector, right? She keeps him from everything, basically. As well as, like I said, it is well known that the chief of staff to the president runs the White House, as well as the president. She does not. One of Reagan's chief of staffs, Reagan, has something to tell the president, calls up to the residence. It's in the evening. Nancy answers the phone, says, what do you need? And he's like, I need to talk to the president. She said, no, just tell me what it is. He doesn't really want to tell her what's going on. He hangs up the phone on her, right? What do you think happens?
She called him back.
Yeah, he is no longer chief of staff, right? Basically, he shows up to work the next day, and all of his stuff is out on the front porch, right? You don't hang up on Nancy. But what she's probably best known for is the just say no. So if you're a child of the 80s and early 90s like me, you grew up with this super bad taboo that if you ever did any sort of drug whatsoever, your life is beyond messed up, right? And so, you know, not only did it start in the United States, but then it exploded. She got together with first ladies in other countries and, you know, had this big campaign for it. And then she just recently passed away, you know, pretty old in her 90s. But, you know, she, like Reagan, has experienced this wonderful romanticized view that the Reagan presidency is, you know, one of the best. Hillary Clinton. All right, so there's a lot. You know, Hillary Clinton is almost just as busy on a daily basis like Eleanor Roosevelt. Sort of, you know, share some of the same qualities. Two for the price of one. You know, from his young political days in Arkansas as governor, she really basically, you know, politics with him. You know, she's present for a lot of decision making. That carries force to the White House. That upset a lot of people. You know, from the very get-go, as well as, you know, bills, you know, many vices, women, all that. You know, she stands by him and all that. Very early on in the Clinton administration, you know, as they're organizing and figuring out what sort of programs and causes they want to talk about, she kind of gets upset at the cabinet because she doesn't think they're doing enough. And so she really, really wants to focus on health care. The cabinet is like, oh, we'll get to it if we get to it. And she's like, no, we need to do it. So Bill appoints her, you know, this special chairship on healthcare reform, and she has a very stormy battle with Congress. It gets down to the point where, you know, they basically tell her, shut up, you need to sort of go away. Right? She partners with the Attorney General, Janet Reno, in '94, to create the Office of Violence Against Women. And as well as she's the first one to go on and have her own political career. Right? First in the Senate, as Secretary of State, and now as a candidate once again. Right? I thought 2008 was her only chance. You know, I've had to eat my words on that. Now she's making waves, you know, and she's just gaining, you know, that new wave because, you know, she won New York last night, and so she had lost like 7 of the last 8 caucuses, and so now she's getting that momentum back. Laura Bush pretty much continues what Barbara Bush does with education and literacy consciousness, right? Raising this awareness that people need to be, you know, need to know how to read because knowledge is power, right? You got to understand what you're reading. She is super supportive of W in most things. However, she truly goes, and I don't think the Bush family likes this very much, but she very much opposes them on social issues, right? There was that one press conference where when the gay marriage rights were starting to become a thing under the Bush presidency, and he says, you know, it's, you know, this religious union, she basically says, no, it's not. Why does it matter if a man marries a man or a woman marries a woman, right? And she kind of goes off on this liberal agenda, right? And she still continues to say that as well. And then Michelle Obama. Michelle Obama, you know, it's sort of hard to really, truly assess because she's still the first lady. You know, so maybe in a year or two, we'll revisit her a little bit more. She brings children back to the White House, right? And that's important because she has always said, I'm a mother first, then the first lady, or then a wife second, then the first lady, right? But she wanted to protect and keep Sasha and Malia out of the limelight. I think she's done a decent job of that, but she sort of has this motherly, you know, cloud over the White House. However, she has taken up causes, you know, exercise and healthy eating. You know, it was plastered all over the Disney Channel with the Let's Move campaign. She has been pretty outspoken on social causes such as gay rights and stuff like that. However, she has dealt with something that is kind of unique to the First Ladies from time to time, with this image enigma, right? Campaign Obama, candidate Obama, when they're running, she went under a lot of scrutiny of the way she looked, right? And the one that I remember is her eyebrows were too pointy. So she had to change that, right? Her hair's to this. She wears too much of that, right? And so First Lady serves as this role model, as like head woman of the country, maybe, and so she has to also look the part. So, lessons from the East Wing, right? I truly think to understand the presidency fully, you have to know the First Lady. You just have to know, you have to study, you have to keep her in mind. A lot of contributions to society, from mental health under Rosalynn Carter, to beautification under Lady Bird, education under both Bush wives, healthcare, and women's rights under Clinton, and then exercise under Obama, right? These contributions to society that are lasting. Presidential legislation gets overturned, right? First Lady causes have a lasting contribution to society. First Ladies have also been largely part of the political decision process. As well as, so there's this idea, and there's this new book about the President's Club and how, ex-presidents get together, they have this makeshift club. First Ladies also have that too. They're very much into supporting each other, right? Rosalynn Carter and Betty Ford had such a unique relationship. Right? First Ladies have eulogized each other at funerals. That's where you see a lot of, right? Every First Lady was present at Nancy Reagan's funeral, like they were at Lady Bird's, at Betty Ford's, right? And then here, for other political events, the opening of the George W. Bush's library in Texas, right? You get the First Ladies just work well together. As well as, there's this growing academic interest, right? More people are paying attention to the First Lady more than ever. More scholarship has been done, right? I've written term papers in grad school about this. My master's thesis was about it, right? Don't know if I exactly made the case. However, I branched off of it. And so, First Ladies are important to the presidency, important to the country, and it's quite interesting when you really look about those roles and expectations, and then how they developed into advisors, emissaries, talking points, sounding points. So, thank you.